I was a shadow in a house of gold working for a man whose heart was made of stone. Every day I scrubbed floors that didn't need cleaning and polished silver that reflected nothing but my own exhaustion. To him I was just another faceless servant, a girl from the streets who should be grateful for the crumbs falling from his table. But he didn't know that my silence was a choice and my poverty was a mask. He had no idea that the woman he treated like trash was actually the queen of the very empire that kept him afloat. Before we get into the rest of this incredible story, I want to take a moment to welcome you all. Who are you, and where are you watching us from? Write your city and country in the comments below, because we love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a big like right now. It helps us keep sharing these powerful lessons with the world. Now let's see what happens when a bully finally meets his match. My name is Aaliyah, and for months I allowed Mr. Sterling to believe I was nothing. I took his insults, and I cleaned his messes while carrying the weight of the world and a new life inside me. People often ask how a woman who once controlled boardrooms ended up holding a mop in a drafty mansion. The truth is simple and terrifying. When my husband Marcus Blackwood passed away in a tragic accident that many whispered was no accident at all, I became a target. The Blackwood empire was vast, and there were sharks in every corner of our lives, relatives and business partners who saw my unborn child not as a miracle, but as a threat to their inheritance. I had to disappear to protect the only piece of Marcus I had left. I changed my name, I hid my bank accounts, and I took a job as a humble maid in the house of a man Marcus once mentioned as a low-level associate. Mr. Sterling was a man who grew up with a silver spoon and used it to poke at the eyes of anyone he deemed inferior. He was a man of expensive habits and a cheap soul. Every morning began the same way. I would arrive at 5 in the morning, my feet already swollen from the pregnancy, and I would begin the grueling task of maintaining his ego. He lived in a house of glass and marble, but it felt more like a prison to me. Sterling would walk through the halls intentionally spilling coffee on the white rugs, just to watch me scrub them on my knees. He would laugh with his shallow friends about how hard it was to find good help these days, referring to me as if I were a malfunctioning appliance rather than a human being. On this particular Tuesday, the heat was suffocating. The air conditioning in the servants' quarters had been broken for weeks, and Sterling refused to fix it, saying that sweat would make us work faster. I was polishing the mahogany banister of the grand staircase, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. I had to stop for a second to catch my breath and steady myself against the railing. That was the moment he walked in. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my supposed yearly salary, and his face was twisted in its usual scowl. He stopped right above me on the stairs and looked down with such pure disgust it made my skin crawl. He asked me why I was standing still and if he was paying me to decorate his hallway with my presence. I apologized softly and told him I felt a bit dizzy, but that only fueled his cruelty. He told me that my health was not his concern, and that if I couldn't handle the work I should go back to the gutter where he found me. Then he did something truly monstrous. He held out his glass of vintage champagne and tilted it slowly, letting the golden liquid pour directly onto my head and down my uniform. He laughed as the cold alcohol soaked through my clothes and the glass slipped from his fingers, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces right next to my hand. He told me I was a clumsy, pathetic woman and that a person like me shouldn't even be allowed to breathe the same air as him. He sneered at my pregnant belly and said that the world didn't need another beggar. He claimed my child was destined for a life of crime and poverty, just like its mother. He told me I was a parasite feeding off his generosity. Something inside me snapped. The fear that had kept me hidden for months was suddenly replaced by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even wipe the champagne from my face. I stood up slowly, ignoring the pain in my back, and looked him directly in the eyes. I told him that money couldn't buy class, and it certainly couldn't buy a soul. I told him that he was the poorest man I had ever met because he had nothing but his bank balance. He was so outraged by my defiance that his face turned a deep shade of purple. He screamed at me to get out. He told me I was fired and that I wouldn't receive a single cent for the months of labor I had given him. He called me a thief and told me to take my rags and leave before he called the police to drag me out in handcuffs. I went to the small closet where I kept my few belongings. My hands were shaking not from fear but from the realization that the time for hiding was over. The safety I sought in obscurity was an illusion because evil people will find you whether you are in a palace or a pantry. In my haste to pack, a folder slipped from my bag and a single piece of paper fluttered across the floor, landing at Sterling's feet. He had followed me to ensure I didn't steal anything. He picked it up with a smirk, ready to rip it to shreds, just to hurt me one last time. But as his eyes grazed the paper, the smirk died. He turned the paper over and saw the official holographic seal of Blackwood Global. This wasn't just a medical record. It was an ultrasound scan attached to a legal notification of a trust fund worth $100 million established for the unborn heir of the Blackwood estate. His eyes widened as he read the names. Aaliyah Blackwood, the widow of Marcus Blackwood. The woman the entire financial world had been searching for. The woman whose husband's company held the debt to his mansion, his cars, and his failing tech firm. The silence in the hallway was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall and the sound of his heavy, uneven breathing. The color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost. He looked at the paper, then at me, then back at the paper. He realized in that moment that the woman he had been spitting on was the owner of his life. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic dry squeak came out. He started to stumble over his apologies, trying to offer me a seat and a glass of water with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. He even reached down to pick up the crumpled dollars he had thrown at me earlier, trying to press them into my hand, as if that could undo the months of abuse. He called me Mrs. Blackwood and begged me to understand that he was just having a bad day. I didn't move. I didn't accept his apologies. I walked to the large bay window and pulled the heavy velvet curtains back. At that exact moment, a fleet of 6 black SUVs pulled into his private driveway, blocking his sports cars. My security team, led by Agent Marcus, stepped out. They were men who didn't take orders from anyone but me. They entered the house with a silent military precision that made Sterling shrink into the corner. One of them stepped forward and draped a soft cashmere coat over my shoulders. I looked at Sterling, who was now literally on his knees. He was sobbing and telling me he didn't know who I was. I looked down at him with the same cold indifference he had shown me. I told him that the problem wasn't that he didn't know who I was. The problem was how he treated people he thought were beneath him. I told him that if I had really been a poor homeless woman, his cruelty would have been even worse, because she would have had no way to fight back. I informed him that my lawyers had spent the morning finalizing the paperwork. Blackwood Global had purchased his debt and was foreclosing on this property effective immediately. I gave him exactly 10 minutes to pack his things and leave. I told him to take his expensive suits and his empty pride and get out of my sight. He begged for a week or even a day, but I reminded him of his own words. I told him he should be grateful for the crumbs, because from now on that was all he would have. I watched him scramble in fear, losing everything he valued because he chose cruelty over kindness. As I watched him being escorted out by my security, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since Marcus died. I realized that my child wouldn't grow up in hiding, but in the light of the truth. I touched my belly and felt a strong kick, a sign that the next generation of Blackwoods was ready to take on the world. I walked through the house one last time, not as a maid but as the owner. I looked at the broken glass on the floor and smiled, because the glass was the only thing that had truly broken that day. My spirit was stronger than ever. Justice isn't always fast, and it doesn't always come in the way we expect, but it is certain. For every person who tries to push you down, there's a power within you that can lift you up higher than they could ever imagine. Never let someone else's narrow vision of you define your worth. You are more than your job, you are more than your bank account, and you are certainly more than the insults of a bully. The world may try to label you by what you do, but only you can define who you are. Standing there in the middle of that mansion, I realized that my strength didn't come from the millions in the bank. It came from the dignity I maintained while holding that mop. It came from the love I had for my child and the legacy of the man I lost. Mr. Sterling thought he was a king, but he was just a tenant in a house built on hollow promises. True royalty is found in how you treat those who can do nothing for you. As the doors closed on his former life, I opened the door to my future. Every step I took on those marble floors now sounded like a promise. A promise that my son or daughter would know that they come from a line of warriors. We don't hide from the storm, we become the storm. I signaled my team to begin the inventory. Nothing was to be left behind that reminded me of the man who lived here. We would transform this place into something meaningful, a sanctuary for those the world tries to overlook. A place where good help isn't a servant, but a hand reaching out to lift someone up. I looked out at the city skyline from the balcony. Somewhere out there were others like the woman I had pretended to be. Women working 2 jobs, carrying the weight of families on their shoulders, being ignored by men like Sterling. I knew then what my new mission would be. The Blackwood fortune wasn't just for me. It was a tool for justice. I sat down at the desk that used to be his and began to write. Not as a maid taking orders, but as a leader taking charge. My first act was to restore the dignity of everyone who had worked in this house. I called the staff together and told them their wages were tripled and their working conditions were now the best in the country. The look of hope on their faces was worth more than the $100 million trust fund. I saw myself in their eyes and I smiled. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the room. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a legend. I wasn't just Aaliyah the widow, I was Aaliyah the builder. And I was just getting started. I remembered the days when I had to count every penny for a bus ride. I remembered the cold nights in the closet listening to the wind howl outside. Those memories were now my fuel. I would never let myself forget the feeling of the mop in my hands. It would remind me to stay grounded even when I was flying high. I contacted my legal team to look into the accident that took Marcus. Now that I had the resources and the visibility, I would find the truth. No one who harmed my family would be safe. Sterling was just the first domino to fall. There were many others who had profited from my husband's death and my disappearance. They probably thought they had won. They probably thought I was gone forever. How wrong they were. The news of my return would hit the headlines by morning. The markets would react. The sharks would start circling, but this time I was the one with the teeth. I looked at the ultrasound photo again. A tiny life with a massive destiny. I would make sure this child grew up in a world that was a little bit kinder because I had passed through it. We would build schools and hospitals. We would fund entrepreneurs who were told they weren't presentable enough for bank loans. We would be the voice for the voiceless. Because I had been voiceless, and I knew how loud that silence could be. The mansion was quiet now, but it was a peaceful quiet. No more shouting, no more insults, just the sound of progress. I stood up and walked to the nursery room Sterling had never used. It was empty and cold. I would fill it with light and toys and laughter. I would make it a home. Something Sterling never understood was that a house is just buildings, but a home is heart. The transition was nearly complete. My bags were unpacked and my true identity was restored. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a maid with champagne in her hair. I saw a woman who had walked through fire and come out forged in steel. The path ahead was long and filled with challenges. But after today, I knew I could handle anything. If I could survive Sterling's mansion, I could survive anything the world threw at me. I was Aaliyah Blackwood, and I was home. The shadows were gone, and the gold finally belonged to someone who knew its true value. It was a value measured in kindness, not in coins. And as the moon rose, I felt the weight of the past finally lift. Tomorrow would be the first day of the rest of my life, a life where I would never have to hide again. A life where my child would be proud to carry the name Blackwood. And a life where bullies like Sterling would be nothing but a distant memory. Thank you once again for being part of our community. Your presence here makes these stories possible. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave a like to show your support. Every comment you leave helps us understand what stories move you the most. We are grateful for every single one of you. Stay strong, stay kind, and remember that your true value is within you. We look forward to sharing more incredible tales of transformation and triumph with you. Until next time, keep believing in the power of justice. Goodbye for now.